This is the only surviving motion picture footage known to show a real trench raid during the First World War. That single fact alone says a great deal about the conflict, about the technology of the time, and about how the war was experienced by the millions of people who never saw the front lines for themselves. Because trench raids were not rare. In fact, they were a routine and essential part of life on the Western Front. Night after night, small groups of soldiers crossed into no man's land, cut through barbed wire, slipped into enemy trenches, and returned, if they were lucky, before dawn. These raids were violent, fast, chaotic, and deeply dangerous. Yet almost none of them were filmed. To understand why this footage is so extraordinary, we first need to understand what trench raids actually were and why they mattered so much. By 1915, the Western Front had hardened into a long line of trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Large-scale offensives often resulted in enormous casualties for very limited gains. Between these major battles, however, the war never stopped. Commanders on both sides needed information. They needed to know where enemy units were positioned, how strong they were, what new defenses had been built, and whether preparations for an attack were underway. The only reliable way to gather that intelligence was to go out and get it. This is where trench raids came in. A typical raid might involve anywhere from a handful of soldiers to several dozen. These men were often volunteers selected for stealth, physical fitness, and nerves of steel. They trained specifically for this kind of warfare. They studied maps, memorized trench layouts, rehearsed routes, and coordinated signals. Every detail mattered because once they left their own trenches, they entered one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. No man's land was a wasteland of shell holes, mud, shattered trees, tangled wire, and unexploded ordnance. It was constantly watched by enemy sentries and illuminated by flares. Machine guns and artillery could be brought to bear in seconds. Even moving quietly was difficult. Equipment rattled, boots sank into mud, and the ground itself was uneven and treacherous. Speed and silence were everything. Raiding parties often moved under the cover of darkness, sometimes crawling for long stretches to avoid detection. Engineers or specially trained soldiers cut gaps in barbed wire. If the alarm was raised too early, the raid could collapse instantly. Surprise was the only real advantage the raiders had. Once inside the enemy trench, the situation changed completely. Fighting became close, sudden, and intensely personal. Rifles were often too long and unwieldy for narrow trench corridors. Soldiers relied on grenades, pistols, bayonets, knives, and improvised weapons like clubs or sharpened entrenching tools. The objective was rarely to hold ground. Instead, raiders gathered documents, destroyed equipment, captured prisoners, and withdrew as quickly as possible before reinforcements arrived. These operations could last minutes or hours, but they were always tense and unpredictable. Casualties were common. A successful raid might return with valuable intelligence and prisoners. A failed one might end with heavy losses and little to show for it. Now imagine trying to film that. Early motion picture cameras were not designed for this environment. They were heavy, delicate, and mechanically complex. Many required tripods and stable positioning. Film reels were short and had to be changed frequently. Exposure times demanded steady light, and even under ideal conditions, filming required preparation and planning. A trench raid offered none of these things. Carrying a camera into no man's land would have been a massive burden. It would slow movement, create noise, and make the entire raiding party more vulnerable. Every additional piece of equipment increased risk. Every extra second spent setting up a shot increased the chance of detection. The success of a raid depended on speed and surprise. A camera threatened both. Lighting was an even greater problem. Most trench raids happened at night or in the dim hours before sunrise. Darkness was protection. It concealed movement and reduced the effectiveness of enemy fire. Early film technology struggled even in daylight. Night filming in combat conditions was virtually impossible. Artificial lighting would have revealed the raiders instantly, turning them into targets. Then there was the issue of survival. Cameramen were not combat troops. Asking them to accompany raiding parties meant exposing them to one of the most dangerous tasks on the front. Commanders were reluctant to risk lives and missions for the sake of documentation. Censorship also shaped what could and could not be filmed. Governments tightly controlled war imagery. They wanted to maintain public morale, and avoid showing the most brutal realities of trench warfare. Images of destruction were permitted. Images of preparation and movement were allowed. But the most chaotic, violent moments were rarely captured. This created a problem. The public wanted to see the war. Film had become a powerful medium, and audiences expected moving images from the front. When real footage could not be obtained, filmmakers turned to reenactments. Behind the lines, soldiers staged attacks for cameras. Trenches were reconstructed. Explosions were carefully arranged. Troops advanced in controlled, repeatable movements. These scenes were not necessarily intended to deceive in a malicious sense. They were created because it was the only practical way to show audiences what trench warfare might look like. Over time, however, these staged scenes took on a life of their own. As films were copied and redistributed, context was lost. Labels disappeared. Archives became fragmented. What began as reenactments slowly became accepted as genuine combat footage. Even today, many widely circulated clips of First World War combat are not what they appear to be. They are reconstructions, valuable historical artifacts in their own right, but not direct records of battle. That is why real footage of a trench raid is so extraordinary. It represents a rare moment when technology, opportunity, and circumstance aligned just long enough to capture something that was almost never filmed. It offers a glimpse into a form of warfare that shaped daily life on the Western Front but remained largely invisible to the camera. The rarity of such footage also reminds us how limited the visual record of the First World War truly is. Later conflicts would be documented extensively by portable cameras and embedded journalists. By the time of the Second World War, cameras were smaller, faster, and more adaptable. Combat footage became far more common. But during the First World War, most of the fighting happened beyond the reach of film. What survives today is only a fragment of a much larger reality. Letters, diaries, and memories tell us about trench raids in detail. Soldiers described the fear, the adrenaline, the confusion, and the violence. Yet moving images of those moments are almost non-existent. This single piece of footage stands as an exception to that silence. It reminds us that history is often incomplete, that what we see is only a small portion of what happened, and that sometimes the rarest images are not the most dramatic or most polished, but simply the ones that manage to survive. Out of millions of soldiers, thousands of raids, and 4 years of relentless conflict, only one surviving film fragment shows a real trench raid unfolding. And that alone makes it extraordinary. If you appreciate restored historical footage and stories like this, make sure to subscribe to History Safe. Your support helps keep these rare moments from the past alive and accessible. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with others who love history. Every interaction helps History Safe uncover, restore, and bring more forgotten footage back to life. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more incredible history.